In the United States, transgender women, men, and children have found themselves the main target of a violent culture war. At a major conservative conference last week, one right-wing commentator even called for transgenderism to be eradicated. It comes as Republican lawmakers have put forward hundreds of bills in 40 states since the start of this year, targeting transgender people and other members of the LGBTQ community. Many of them restrict access to gender-affirming health care, which research shows is crucial to the well-being and survival of trans people. Well, for more, we can cross to the U.S. and speak to Erin Reed. She's an activist and researcher who tracks trans legislation across the country. Erin, thank you so much for being awake so late to speak to us. Can you just start by walking us through some of this legislation and what it does?
Of course. So I have tracked over 430 bills that target the transgender community in the United States. The majority of these bills are going to be targeting, for instance, healthcare. They would ban gender-affirming care for transgender youth under the age of 18. Some of them also target transgender adults, as well as spell out how doctors should medically detransition the transgender youth under their care. I'm also tracking drag bans, so things that target people going out in public in drag, bans on books, bathroom bans. Some bills target the parents of transgender youth with child abuse, and there are even some bills that would essentially allow for the state to take custody of transgender kids or the kids of transgender parents.
And can you explain more about what gender-affirming healthcare is and why it's so important, particularly for trans children?
Of course. So gender affirming healthcare for trans kids typically under the age of 12 is nothing more than dress and pronouns. So, haircut, pronouns, names, and that's it. Once the child reaches the age of 12 to 14 years old, they may be started on reversible puberty blockers, which buys a little bit more time and allows for more therapeutic assessment of the kid. At such a point as the child is medically assessed by their team, their psychologist, their therapist, as well as their family consenting, the child will then progress to hormone therapy. Surgeries are typically left till after 18. This care is really important for transgender youth because numerous studies have shown that it dramatically improves the mental health care and well-being, reduces the need for surgeries in the future, as well as reduces the suicide rates, which can be very high among this population, over 40% in some research. Studies have shown that gender-affirming care will actually reduce suicide rates by up to 73%, depending on the kind of care that they're receiving and at what age they receive it. So this care has been shown to be tremendously life-saving for this population. And the parents that testify at these hearings testify to that effect, saying that they go from having depressed and suicidal kids before transition to having thriving children afterwards. This is just how it works.
And the proponents of these laws point to stories about people who realize later in life that they weren't actually trans. They argue that children shouldn't be making such big decisions. As you mentioned, some go so far as to equate gender-affirming care with child abuse. What do you make of those arguments?
I first want to say that detransitioners are extremely important and we need to take care of them in our communities. But I will also say that having known the research around detransition, it being a relatively rare thing, as well as having known detransitioners and worked with them myself, the vast majority of people that detransition and no longer identify as trans whenever they get older do so not because they are not trans, but rather because they are facing increasing discrimination in the United States. This typically tends to be around 2.5% of transgender individuals, according to most studies. And typically, these tend to be people that transition older that typically detransition. Trans youth typically are extremely persistent in their gender identities. So, these are complex decisions. And I think that there are potentials for difficulties with transition. And whenever we have these complex decisions in the United States, the typical way that these people are treated is by allowing the parents to be the ones to work with that care team, with the doctors to help make these decisions, because nobody knows their own kids better than the parents themselves.
And this isn't the first time that trans people have come under attack in the United States. Several years ago, we had these so-called bathroom bills focusing on banning trans women from using women's restrooms. Why do you think that these attacks are gaining so much traction right now?
I'm glad that you mentioned the transgender bathroom bill in 2015 in North Carolina. It was a very famous bill. We have not seen another bill that targets transgender people in bathrooms until this year. We see one in Arkansas and one in Florida that would charge transgender people with sex crimes just for entering the bathroom. So these bills are coming back. The North Carolina ban was a tremendous hit to North Carolina. It hit them economically for passing that ban. The NBA All-Star Game pulled out of North Carolina because of it. I think that we're seeing the current attacks right now on trans people because of the weaponization and the fear campaign that has been waged against the community, both the trans community and the LGBTQ community as a whole. So, for instance, we have seen groomer language, calling LGBTQ people as groomers, and saying that LGBTQ people, and especially trans people, are a danger around children. And increasingly, we see the laws that are being passed and the laws that are being promoted target transgender individuals using children as a weaponization against trans people. So this goes from everything to book bans, to drag bans, to medical bans on trans youth, to the bathroom bills that first started again in these schools, to taking the children of transgender parents away, to charging people with child abuse. And so we are seeing this in several states. And I believe that this is because of the sustained fear campaign that we have seen among the far right in the United States, both from the far-right militias that have acted in the United States, like the Proud Boys, all the way to some of the governorships. Again, I mentioned Florida. This is where a lot of the things are going on right now, and where Governor Ron DeSantis, is currently spearheading a lot of these initiatives.
There's also been concern about media outlets like the New York Times drawing a disproportionate amount of attention to trans issues in a harmful way. Can you maybe talk about some basic guidelines on how trans issues should be covered by the media?
Of course. I was a signatory to the letter to the New York Times, and I signed it for very particular reasons. Transgender coverage in the New York Times tends to be very slanted. It does not include trans voices very often. And the people that they speak to, again, whenever we spoke earlier about detransitioners, tend to be the rare few detransitioners that detransition because they no longer identify as trans, when we know from research that the vast majority of people that detransition do so because of the harmful legislation and the harmful discriminatory policies that we've seen. Those voices tend to be underrepresented in the media, especially in the New York Times. And also, we have seen a serious lack of transgender people being allowed to cover trans issues in the New York Times and in other outlets. And so for these reasons, I signed the letter calling on the New York Times to hire more trans staff, to speak to more trans people, to diversify their coverage, to be honest in the way that they present research. You know, we saw, for instance, in one article, they got so many facts wrong that the World Professional Association of Transgender Health came out and released a 3-page memo dictating each single fact that was wrong, the scientific errors that the paper had made. These errors are unexcusable for a major paper of the New York Times caliber.
And just finally, Erin, are we seeing any states that are trying to counter this wave of anti-trans legislation and maybe moving to protect trans rights?
We are. Several states have actually moved in the opposite direction. And so I do want to emphasize that this is not a singular pushback against trans rights. We have seen in places like California, Minnesota, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, bills that have been passed or proposed that would protect trans people that flee the criminalizing states and get to the borders of Minnesota, get to the borders of California. And this sounds rather alarming, but this is the situation that people are in right now. They're looking at the laws in their states, seeing that their children might be taken away, seeing that their care might be banned, and they are looking to flee to other states within the United States. And so, yes, we are seeing protective measures. We are seeing bills in some of these states that also cover healthcare coverage for these trans people, especially the vulnerable ones that need care on Medicaid. We're seeing further protections like in Michigan, where they have added gender identity as a protected class. And so, yes, we are seeing a sort of bifurcation in how transgender people are treated within the United States, depending on the party control of each individual state.
All right, Erin, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you again so much for staying up so late to speak with us here on France 24. Again, that is Erin Reed. She's an activist and researcher who tracks trans legislation, anti-trans legislation across the country.